A man booked on one of the planes that struck the World Trade Center survived because of a hangover. His show was canceled twice and brought back by DVD sales alone, the first time that ever happened. One episode has never aired in America. A children's choir mocked a brain-damaged woman on national television. This is the entire story of Family Guy, and a dorm room in Rhode Island is where it actually begins. The man, the dorm room, and the dog. Kent, Connecticut is a small town of a few thousand people tucked into the western corner of the state, the kind of place where nothing much happens and everyone knows it. In the mid-1970s, a boy named Seth Woodbury McFarlane was growing up there, and from a very early age, he was doing something that set him apart from the other children in town. He was drawing cartoons. Not casually, not as a hobby alongside other hobbies, but with the focused, almost obsessive energy of someone who had already decided, well before he had any business deciding anything, that this was the work he intended to do with his life. Local newspapers ran small articles about him before he was 15. He was that kind of kid. The kind whose dedication is visible from a distance. The kind who makes adults stop and pay attention because the seriousness in what they are doing does not match their age. By the time McFarlane was ready for college, he had one school in mind and no real interest in alternatives. The Rhode Island School of Design, known to anyone who has ever attended it simply as RISD, is a small and intensely focused institution in Providence, built around the belief that making things well is a complete way of spending a life. Painters go there, sculptors go there, industrial designers and glass blowers and printmakers go there. Animators also go there, and McFarlane enrolled as one, arriving in the early 1990s with a head already full of voices and timing and the particular comedic instinct that is very hard to teach and very easy to recognize in someone who simply has it. He studied hard and he watched people carefully. He listened to the way voices changed depending on the speaker, the setting, the weight of what was being said. One of the most important moments in the entire history of Family Guy happened not in a classroom, but near one, somewhere on or near the RISD campus, when McFarlane overheard a security guard talking. Nobody recorded the conversation. The words themselves were unremarkable. What stayed with McFarlane was the voice, the particular flat nasal texture of it, the working class Rhode Island quality that had something both confident and slightly hapless buried inside it. He filed it away without knowing exactly why. Years later, that overheard voice became the voice of Peter Griffin, and everything that followed from that one moment of paying attention. The thesis film came in 1995. McFarlane was in his final year at RISD, and like every animation student, he was required to produce a significant piece of original work to complete his degree. He made a short film called The Life of Larry. It starred a middle-aged man named Larry Cummings, a dim, cheerful, and deeply unself-aware fellow who lived with his cynical talking dog Steve, his patient wife Lois, and his overweight teenage son Milt. The humor was fast and built around a gap that McFarlane would spend the next 3 decades exploring, the gap between how a man sees himself and how the world around him actually sees him. Steve the dog was the only character who truly understood what was happening at any given moment. There were cutaway gags, there were musical moments, there was a restless, sideways energy to the whole thing, an inability to stay in one place for very long before jumping to something else and then jumping back that would become the defining rhythm of the show McFarlane had not yet invented. The Life of Larry was, in almost every way that mattered, an early draft of Family Guy. The raw shape of one of the longest-running animated series in television history was sitting inside a student film made almost entirely by one person in his early 20s, shown primarily in his dormitory to whoever would sit still long enough to watch it. McFarlane presented the film at a senior screening, the formal event where RISD animation students showed their completed work to faculty and peers. Among the people in that room was Ellen Cockrill, a development executive from Hanna-Barbera, one of the most historically significant names in American animation. The studio behind the Flintstones and Scooby-Doo and a vast catalog of cartoons that had defined the medium for generations was running an initiative called What a Cartoon, a program designed to find new talent by inviting young animators to make original short films for broadcast on Cartoon Network. Cockrill saw The Life of Larry at that screening and offered McFarlane a development position at the studio before he had technically finished his degree. He was 21 years old. He said yes. What followed was a period of real education in how television animation actually worked. McFarlane joined the studio not primarily as an artist, but as a writer, which was unusual for someone hired at his level, and which said something honest about where the real engine of his work lived. He worked on Dexter's Laboratory. He worked on Cow and Chicken. He worked on Johnny Bravo, a show whose production relied more heavily on script scripted writing than the other series he had joined, which suited him in a way the others had not quite managed. On Johnny Bravo, he met Adam West, the actor who had played Batman in the 1960s television series, a meeting that would eventually deposit the former Caped Crusader into the mayor's office of a fictional Rhode Island town called Quahog for the better part of 2 decades. In 1996, Hanna-Barbera asked McFarlane to produce a follow-up to The Life of Larry for the What a Cartoon program. He made a short called Larry and Steve, which kept the 2 central characters from the original film, but moved Steve the dog further toward the center of the action. The format shifted slightly too. Where the first film let most characters hear Steve speak, in this version, only Larry could understand him. To everyone else, the dog was simply barking. A pilot character in the short had a chin and a vocal quality that closely resembled what would eventually become Glenn Quagmire. A store in the film was named Stewie's. There was already an airplane involved. The show was broadcasting its future into its own past, hiding the characters it had not yet created inside the characters it had already made. Fox executives saw both films. They were, at that moment, in a particular kind of institutional hunger. The Simpsons had demonstrated years earlier that an animated comedy could hold a prime-time audience of adults, and that demonstration had rearranged the economics of television. Studios had been searching ever since for other animated shows that could do something comparable. When Fox saw McFarlane's work, they moved quickly. They told him they wanted him to develop a series based on his characters, and they gave him $50,000 and a deadline to produce a 15-minute pilot. McFarlane spent roughly 6 months building that pilot. He has described the experience across several interviews over the years, and the picture that emerges is unglamorous in the specific way that early creative work often is. He was working almost entirely alone. He drew constantly. He slept very little. He recorded voices in his kitchen. He was building a complete television show from nearly nothing, with a budget that most productions would consider inadequate for a single week of work, let alone 6 months of it. He told a reporter from the New York Times that the period involved no sleep and no life, just drawing like crazy in his kitchen and doing this pilot. The pilot he produced was rough. It was unpolished in the way that something made by one person on very little money and very little rest tends to be unpolished, but it communicated exactly what it needed to communicate. It had tone. It had voice. It had the sense that something specific and distinctive was happening, something that was not simply an imitation of everything that had come before. Fox saw the completed pilot in May of 1998. The network responded well enough to order 13 episodes. McFarlane was given a contract reported at the time to be worth $2 million per season, which at 24 years old made him something that had never existed before in American television, the youngest executive producer in the medium's history. He had gone from a dorm room screening in Providence to running a primetime network show in 3 years. The show that emerged from all of this was called Family Guy, and it centered on the Griffin family of Quahog, Rhode Island. Peter Griffin was the father, a large, broad-shouldered, powerfully unintelligent man who worked at a brewery and had a habit of injuring himself in absurd ways and holding strong opinions about things he did not understand. He was built on the foundation of Larry Cummings from the thesis film Reshaped and Amplified, with that overheard security guard's voice living underneath everything he said. Lois Griffin was his wife, a red-haired woman from old money who had married down and had long since made a kind of peace with that fact. Their children were Meg, the ignored and perpetually humiliated oldest daughter, Chris, the sweet and dim son who resembled his father in almost every way except that he was still young enough to be forgiven for it, and Stewie, an infant with a football-shaped head, a British accent, and a persistent desire to kill his mother and conquer the world. Living with them was Brian, a talking dog who drank martinis, wrote fiction that no one wanted to publish, and served as the most reliably reasonable voice in a household full of unreasonable people. Larry had become Peter. Steve had become Brian. The family name of the characters had shifted, but the blueprint had not changed much. McFarlane voiced 4 of the 6 central characters himself: Peter, Brian, Stewie, and the neighborhood pilot Quagmire. He drew the voice of Peter from that Rhode Island security guard he had never officially met. Stewie's voice came from somewhere even more unexpected, a film he had loved in college, the 1964 musical My Fair Lady, in which the English actor Rex Harrison played a demanding and fussy professor. McFarlane had developed an impression of Harrison's particular clipped, impatient delivery in order to entertain people at parties. He described finding something amusing and ridiculous in Harrison's manner, and said that he had come up with the idea of putting that voice into the body of a baby, and that is how Stewie was born. The character of Brian had a voice that required the least departure from McFarlane's own speaking speaking voice. Brian was, in ways the show would return to over and over, the character closest to MacFarlane himself, sharing his political views, his atheism, his appreciation for jazz and literature, his tendency to be self-righteous at precisely the wrong moment. The show premiered on January 31st, 1999, in a position that gave it an enormous advantage. Fox scheduled it immediately following Super Bowl 33, which meant the pilot episode of an unproven animated comedy about a dysfunctional family in Rhode Island was seen by roughly 22 million people on its very first night. For a show that would twice be canceled and twice have to claw its way back from the dead, that opening number was a gift that the ratings would not sustain. But on that single night, in the last January of the 20th century, almost everyone who owned a television and had watched the Super Bowl sat around and watched The Griffin Family for the first time. MacFarlane had stacked the writing staff with people who knew what they were doing. David Zuckerman, who had worked on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, was among the early hires. So was Chris Sheridan, who came from Living Single. And there was Mike Henry, who had no major television credits, but had met MacFarlane years earlier at RISD, where Henry had traveled to visit his brother and ended up in the orbit of a young animator who was just then figuring out what he wanted to make. Henry would go on to voice the character of Cleveland Brown, the soft-spoken and perpetually patient neighbor who lived on Spooner Street, and who would eventually get his own spin-off series. The hiring of Henry is the kind of detail that matters in the history of a long show, because it is a reminder that most of the people who end up central to something important arrive not through formal processes, but through friendship and proximity and being in the right place. The world of Quahog was assembled from pieces MacFarlane had been collecting for years. The name of the town comes from the quahog clam, a shellfish native to Rhode Island, which gave the fictional setting a geographical root in the real place where the creator had gone to school. The bar where Peter and his friends drank was called the Drunken Clam. The neighbors were Joe Swanson, a paraplegic police officer, and Glenn Quagmire, the airline pilot whose moral compass pointed in a consistent and deeply problematic direction. These were not random figures. They were the kind of people MacFarlane had watched and listened to and filed away, translated into animation, made extreme enough to be funny, and then placed in a setting just realistic enough that their extremity had somewhere to land. What Fox had bought, and what the audience saw for the first time that Super Bowl Sunday, was a show that owed something to The Simpsons in its general shape, a dysfunctional animated family navigating ordinary life in an American suburb, and that owed something to the sketch comedy tradition in its willingness to abandon the main story and wander off into a digression that had nothing to do with anything and then wander back. The cutaway gag, the device that would become both the show's most celebrated and most criticized feature, was already present in that first episode. A character would say something that reminded them of something else, or the narrator would announce that something was stranger than a particular situation, and the screen would cut to that other thing, play it out for 15 seconds or a minute, and then return. The effect was like watching someone tell a story and getting distracted by every other story they had ever heard. For the audience that found it funny, it was the funniest thing on television. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 1 is traced the long road from a Connecticut boyhood to a Super Bowl debut, from a student film shown in a dorm room to a primetime show watched by 22 million people. Up next, the story takes a turn that almost no one saw coming, because Fox was about to do something it had never done to a show with that kind of beginning, and it would do it twice. Section 2, canceled, buried, and brought back from the dead. Something strange happens when a television network moves a show around the schedule without telling anyone. The audience, which is not a single unified thing, but rather millions of separate people each making small decisions about what to watch and when, gradually loses track of where the show has gone. Some of them find it again. Many of them do not. The ones who do not find it stop being counted, and the ratings fall. And the people at the network look at the numbers and draw the obvious conclusion, which is that the audience has stopped caring, when what has actually happened is that the network has simply made the audience impossible to find. This is roughly what happened to Family Guy between 1999 and 2002, and understanding it requires slowing down and looking at the schedule changes one by one, because each move made the next move more likely, and by the time the final cancellation came, it had the feel of something inevitable, when it was really the product of a series of decisions that did not have to be made the way they were made. The show premiered in January 1999, following the Super Bowl, which was about as good a launch as any new program could hope for. 22 million people watched that first episode. Those are the kinds of numbers that networks build careers around, and they created an expectation that the show would continue performing at something close to that level. It did not. The Super Bowl audience is not the same same as a show's regular audience. It is borrowed. It is people who happen to be in the room with the television on. People who will watch something new if it is placed in front of them, but who may not seek it out again the following week. When the rest of the first season aired in its regular Sunday night slot, the numbers came back down to something more modest. They were still solid enough to justify a second season, but they were not the 22 million of that first night, and the gap between expectation and reality made Fox nervous. For the second season, the network moved the show to Tuesday nights at 8:30. This was already a meaningful step down from the premium Sunday slot, but it came with a specific problem that Fox may not have fully anticipated. The show that was now airing against Family Guy on Tuesday evenings was a program on ABC called Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? At that particular moment in American television history, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire was not merely a popular show, it was a phenomenon. The quiz format, with its escalating stakes and its simple dramatic question of whether a contestant would take the money or risk it all, had seized the national imagination in a way that very few programs manage. ABC was airing it multiple nights a week, and its ratings were extraordinary. Placing Family Guy directly against it was the kind of scheduling decision that looks, in retrospect, like a quiet form of surrender. The show came in at 114th in the Nielsen ratings during that period, drawing around 6 million households. 6 million is not a small number, in any ordinary sense, but measured against the expectations set by the Super Bowl premiere, and measured against what was happening on the other channel at the same time, it read as failure. Fox canceled the show in May of 2000. The announcement came at the end of the second season, and it appeared at the time to be final. There was no public campaign to save it, no particular outpouring of grief. The show had been on for 2 seasons, it had struggled against an impossible competitor, and the network had made its decision. And then, almost immediately, the network unmade it. In July of 2000, roughly 2 months after the cancellation announcement, Fox reversed course and ordered 13 more episodes. What caused the reversal is not entirely clear from the public record, but the most reasonable explanation is that the network looked at the alternatives and found them less appealing than they had expected. The show was brought back for a third season, which began airing in the fall of 2001. The time slot Fox chose for the return was Thursday nights at 8 in the evening. Thursday nights at 8 in the fall of 2001 meant competing with 2 of the most watched programs on American television. One was Friends, then in its 8th season and still pulling numbers that most shows never approach at any point in their existence. The other was Survivor on CBS, the reality competition that had arrived the previous year and reshaped the entire landscape of what was possible on network television. Family Guy was placed between these 2 forces and told to survive. It did not survive in any meaningful rating sense. The numbers dropped further. The season also launched into a national atmosphere that had been profoundly changed by the events of September 11th, 2001, which was a complicated environment for a show built on irreverence and the willingness to make jokes about things that other shows left alone. The audience that had existed before continued to shrink or to get lost in the shuffle, and the Friends viewers and the Survivor viewers stayed where they were. During its second and third seasons, Fox compounded the scheduling problem by moving the show around with very little notice. It would disappear from its announced slot for weeks at a time, replaced by something else, then return without much fanfare. For a viewer trying to follow the series, this was deeply disorienting. Without social media, without the ability to search instantly for when a show was airing, a viewer who tuned in and found something else in that slot had very little way of knowing whether the show had moved, been canceled, or simply been preempted for a sporting event. Many of them assumed the worst and stopped looking. By May of 2002, Fox had seen enough. The network announced its fall lineup, and Family Guy was not in it. Unlike the first cancellation, this one was accompanied by a specific detail that made it feel more complete. There was a finished episode sitting in the vault that had never aired. An episode from the third season that Fox had simply not broadcast. That episode, titled When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, had been pulled before it ever reached the audience due to concerns about its content, which will be explored in detail later in this video. The existence of that unaired episode meant that Family Guy's third season ended with a gap in it, a missing piece that the dedicated viewers knew about but could not watch. For about a year, that appeared to be the end of the story. What happened next was genuinely without precedent in American television. The mechanism that brought Family Guy back from the dead was not a petition or a fan campaign or a passionate letter-writing effort, although those things existed in smaller forms. What brought the show back was the emergence of 2 separate revenue streams that the original cancellation had accidentally created, and those revenue streams communicated something to Fox in the only language that reliably moves a network, which is money. The first stream was Adult Swim. Cartoon Network had launched its late-night programming block for adult viewers in 2001, and by early 2003, the block was looking for content. Fox had tried to sell the rerun rights to Family Guy to other networks and had found very little interest. The president of 20th Century Fox Television later said publicly that the rights had been acquired for almost nothing, a price so low as to be essentially a gift. Cartoon Network, which needed material and was willing to take a chance on something that had been written off, began airing Family Guy reruns on Adult Swim starting in April of 2003. The response was immediate and completely unexpected. Family Guy became the highest-rated program on the Adult Swim block almost instantly, pulling in around 1.9 million viewers per night and boosting viewership in its time slot by an extraordinary 239%. The audience that Fox had been unable to find on Tuesday nights against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and on Thursday nights against Friends was apparently not a small audience at all. It was an audience that had simply never been given the right conditions to gather. Adult Swim provided those conditions. A late-night slot, a channel that was willing to commit to the show, and a kind of promotional consistency that the Fox scheduling had never offered. The viewers who found the show on Adult Swim were younger, they stayed up later, and they were precisely the demographic that advertisers most wanted to reach. The second stream was DVD. In the same week that Family Guy began airing on Adult Swim, Fox released the complete first and second seasons on DVD. The timing was either very smart planning or a very fortunate coincidence, and the result was the same either way. The DVD set sold 400,000 copies within the first month. By the end of 2003, it had sold 2.2 million copies total, making it the best-selling television DVD of the entire year, and the second best-selling television DVD in history up to that point, surpassed only by the first season of Comedy Central's Chappelle's Show. The third season DVD followed and also crossed the million-copy mark. These were not the numbers of a show that nobody cared about. These were the numbers of a show that a devoted audience had been waiting years to own, a show that people wanted to watch again and share with friends who had missed it the first time. Fox was paying attention. The network that had canceled the show twice was now watching it become one of the most talked about programs on cable television and watching its DVD releases move through stores at a rate that established industry precedent. On May 20th, 2004, Fox announced that Family Guy would return for a fourth season. It was the first time in the history of American television that a canceled show had been revived based primarily on DVD sales. That specific detail matters because it changed the way the industry thought about what cancellation meant and what canceled shows were worth. Before Family Guy, a canceled show was largely finished. After Family Guy, canceled shows became potential assets, things that could be monitored and reconsidered, things whose audiences might be measurable in new ways that Nielsen ratings had never captured. The fourth season premiered on May 1st, 2005, 3 years after the show had been removed from the air. It aired on Sunday nights, after The Simpsons, in a slot that gave it cover and consistency, and none of the competitive pressure that had destroyed its ratings the first time around. The premiere drew 11.85 million viewers, a number that validated everything Fox had gambled on by bringing the show back. The production team had been quietly working on the new season for months before the official revival announcement, with the understanding that if Fox declined to take the new episodes, the plan was to offer them to Adult Swim directly. The audience would have had the show one way or another. The writing staff returned with a slightly different set of priorities than the early seasons had operated under. The years away had clarified what the show did best and what it could afford to ignore. MacFarlane himself had spent the gap developing American Dad, a new series that also premiered in 2005, which gave him a creative outlet running parallel to the revival, and meant that Family Guy's return was not the only thing he was building. The two shows shared a network and a Sunday night slot and a general sensibility, but they operated as genuinely separate projects with different creative identities. What the revival demonstrated, beyond the specific details of its own success, was that a show's audience does not simply disappear when a network stops broadcasting it. The people who had watched Family Guy in its original run had not moved on. They had been waiting, watching reruns on Adult Swim, buying DVDs, telling people about a show they remembered finding funny before it vanished. The community around the show had continued to exist during the years the show itself did not, sustained by reruns and home video and word of mouth in an era before social media had given fan communities a permanent architecture to live inside. When the show came back, those people were ready. They turned up in numbers that surprised even the people who had argued for the revival, and they brought new viewers with them, people who had discovered the show on Adult Swim or on DVD and had never seen it in its original broadcast run. The story of Family Guy's cancellation and revival is told often, but the part that tends to get compressed in the telling is how close to permanent the second cancellation was. Fox had genuinely moved on. The network had other things to broadcast, other bets to make, other shows to develop and schedule and worry about. The decision to sell the rerun rights for almost nothing was not the decision of a network that expected to want the show back. The decision to release the DVDs in the same week as the Adult Swim premiere was commercially savvy, but was not part of a revival strategy. Nobody at Fox in May of 2002 had a plan to bring the show back. What happened was that the audience refused to behave the way canceled audiences were supposed to behave, and the money that followed from that refusal made an argument that the network could not ignore. A hangover and a wrong departure time on the morning of September 11th, 2001 had kept the show's creator alive. 2 years later, the stubbornness of an audience that would not stop watching a dead show had kept the show itself alive. Both of those survivals would have seemed improbable at the moment they happened.
Both of them turned out to be permanent.
Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 2 has followed Family Guy through 2 cancellations and one of the most unlikely revivals in television history. But coming back from the dead is only part of the story, because the show that returned in 2005 was not returning to a clean slate. It was returning to a growing list of things that had made powerful people very uncomfortable. And those things had been piling up the whole time it was gone. Section 3, the episodes that frightened the network. Long before the revival, before the DVD sales and the Adult Swim ratings and the unprecedented second chance, Family Guy had already developed a reputation for making Fox nervous. The nervousness was not a single event. It built gradually, one script at a time, one table read at a time, one moment when a network executive read a page and reached for the phone. The show had been on the air for less than 2 full seasons when it produced its first episode that Fox decided the American public should not be allowed to watch. And the pattern that began with that decision would continue for years, accumulating a list of pulled, banned, and quietly buried material that tells its own story about where the boundaries of American television actually sit and who gets to decide where they are. The first episode to run into serious trouble was from the 3rd season, a story built around Peter Griffin's belief that Jewish people are fundamentally better with money than everyone else. The episode was called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and its premise was that Peter, having made a mess of the family finances in the way that Peter reliably makes a mess of everything, becomes convinced that what he needs is a Jewish accountant, because Jewish people must know things about money that other people simply do not. He befriends a man named Max Weinstein, voiced by Ben Stein, and the friendship goes reasonably well until Peter decides that the most logical next step is to have his son Chris converted to Judaism, so that Chris will inherit whatever financial wisdom Peter believes comes automatically with the religion. The episode was written as satire. The joke was not that Peter's beliefs were correct, but that they were the kind of lazy, inherited stereotype that a man like Peter would absorb without ever examining. The writers were not endorsing the prejudice. They were putting it in the mouth of a character whose entire function in the show is to embody the consequences of never thinking anything through. The episode also included a musical number in which Peter sang a parody of the Disney song When You Wish Upon a Star, with new lyrics expressing his wish for a Jewish financial advisor. The parody contained lines that were blunt enough to make people uncomfortable, even when the satirical frame around them was clear. Fox reviewed the episode and decided not to air it. The network's concern was that the content could be read as genuinely anti-Semitic rather than as a parody of anti-Semitism, and that the distinction between the two might not survive the experience of watching it at home without the context of knowing what the writers intended. McFarlane pushed back. He believed the episode was clearly satirical, and that Fox was being overcautious in a way that would ultimately embarrass the network more than the episode itself would. But the network held its position, and When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was pulled from the 3rd season schedule without a broadcast date. The episode did not disappear entirely. It appeared on the 3rd season DVD release, which meant that anyone who bought the disc could watch it at home, even though Fox had never put it on television. And in 2003, when the show began airing on Adult Swim, the episode was finally broadcast there, becoming the first time American viewers could see it on a screen rather than a disc. Fox eventually aired it themselves in 2004, 4 years after it had originally been completed. By the time it reached the Fox airwaves, the controversy around it had largely subsided, and the consensus among the viewers who actually watched it was that the satire was clear enough and that the original decision to pull it had been more cautious than necessary. The lawsuit that came from the musical number is a separate chapter, and it will be covered later in this video. The second episode to be banned was far more serious in the eyes of the network. Serious enough that Fox not only refused to air it, but made the announcement of that refusal before the season containing the episode had even begun broadcasting. This was unusual. Networks pull episodes quietly when they can. Announcing in advance that an episode will not air is an act of conspicuous caution, a way of putting distance between the institution and the content before anyone has had a chance to object to the content itself. The announcement came at the San Diego Comic-Con in 2009, and the episode in question was called Partial Terms of Endearment. The episode episode came from the 8th season and was written by a staff writer named Danny Smith. Its premise was that Lois Griffin agreed to become a surrogate mother for an old college friend named Naomi and her husband Dale. Before the pregnancy was complete, Naomi and Dale were killed in a car accident, leaving Lois in the position of carrying a child for parents who no longer existed.
The episode then followed Lois and Peter as they tried to decide what to do, with Peter initially being persuaded by anti-abortion protesters that ending the pregnancy would be wrong, then reversing his position, then reversing again, the two of them going in circles until Lois made her own decision at the end. Before the writing began, McFarlane had asked Smith to read an essay by the astronomer and writer Carl Sagan about abortion, a piece in which Sagan tried to think through the question from a scientific perspective rather than a political one. The intention was to produce something that took the subject seriously while still functioning as a Family Guy episode, something that presented both sides without collapsing into cheap point scoring. The episode that resulted was, by most accounts from people who have seen it, more balanced and more thoughtful than the premise suggests. Critics who reviewed it when it appeared on DVD generally praised it, and the Fox Entertainment president at the time said publicly that he thought the episode handled the subject well. The reason Fox refused to air it anyway was financial rather than moral. The president of Fox Entertainment explained the decision in terms of the advertising environment. The economy was struggling at the time the episode was scheduled to air, he said, and abortion was the one subject guaranteed to cause problems with advertisers, regardless of how carefully the episode handled it. He was not saying the episode was bad. He was saying that the potential for advertiser withdrawal made it not worth the risk, and that the distinction between a well-made episode about abortion and a poorly made one was essentially irrelevant from a commercial standpoint. The subject itself was the problem, not the treatment.
McFarlane believed, as he had believed with When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, that Fox would eventually change its mind. He scheduled a live table read of the episode at the Ricardo Montalban Theater in Hollywood, performed by the principal cast with a full orchestra, and opened it to an audience. The event was a way of giving the episode a public existence at a moment when Fox was keeping it off the air, a reminder that the work existed and had been seen by real people who had responded to it. The reading drew coverage and attention, and made the refusal to broadcast the episode feel more visible than it might otherwise have been. Fox did not change its mind. Adult Swim, which had aired the show for years, and which had agreed to broadcast other sensitive material, also declined to air partial terms of endearment. The BBC Three channel in the United Kingdom aired it as part of its regular Sunday night schedule in June of 2010, where it was watched by just under 1 million homes and received positive notices. Australia and the Netherlands subsequently broadcast it as well. The only major English-language market where the episode has never aired on television is the United States, the country where it was made. It remains available on DVD, and in the years since 2010, it has been available through digital retail platforms. Disney, when it assembled the international streaming catalog for its Star platform, left the episode out entirely. The pulled episodes tell one part of the story. The episodes that were broadcast and then removed tell another. In March of 2013, Family Guy aired an episode called Turban Cowboy, which included a cutaway gag showing Peter Griffin winning the Boston Marathon by driving his car through the crowd of runners, plowing into the athletes one after another until he crossed the finish line. The joke was dark in the way that many Family Guy jokes are dark, treating violence as an absurdist premise rather than a realistic one, relying on the obvious impossibility of what was being depicted to create a kind of comic distance from the actual meaning of the images. Approximately 1 month after the episode aired, on April 15th, 2013, 2 bombs exploded near the finish line of the actual Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds more. Fox pulled Turban Cowboy from its website and from Hulu within hours of the attack, issuing a statement that the network had no immediate plans to rebroadcast the episode. The speed of the removal reflected a recognition that the cutaway gag, which had existed as obvious cartoon absurdity the month before, now existed in an entirely different context. The distance that makes cartoon violence funny had been collapsed by a real event that used the same location for real harm. McFarlane spoke publicly about the situation, condemning a hoax that had circulated online in the hours after the bombing, in which someone had edited together footage from Turban Cowboy in a way designed to suggest that Family Guy had predicted or even depicted the attack. The edited clip spread rapidly on social media, and McFarlane was emphatic that the manipulation was dishonest and harmful. The actual episode was eventually returned to broadcast rotation in 2014, once enough time had passed that the specific wound of the attack had begun to scar over. But the episode's brief removal illustrated something important about how context transforms meaning, and how a piece of entertainment can be entirely one thing on the day it airs, and something quite different a month later. The episode that drew perhaps the most viscerally
angry response from outside the entertainment industry was not a banned episode or a pulled episode, but one that aired without obstruction during the 8th season in 2010. The episode was called Peter-assment, and most of it was unremarkable by the standards of the show, but it contained a musical number performed by Stewie and his preschool classmates, a cheerful and brightly staged little song about Terry Schiavo. Terry Schiavo was a real person. In 1990, she had collapsed in her home in Florida at the age of 26, suffering cardiac arrest that deprived her brain of oxygen for several minutes. She was resuscitated, but never regained consciousness in any meaningful way, entering a persistent vegetative state from which she did not emerge. Her case became one of the most bitterly fought legal disputes in American history, with her husband arguing that she would not have wanted to be kept alive by artificial means, and her parents arguing the opposite. The legal battle consumed 15 years and drew in the Florida State Legislature, the United States Congress, and President George W. Bush, all of whom took positions on what should happen to one woman in a Florida care facility. Terry Schiavo died in 2005, 15 days after her feeding tube was removed, following a final court ruling in her husband's favor. The Family Guy musical number was performed by animated children, singing lyrics that described her as kinda alive and called her the most expensive plant you'll ever see. The response from Schiavo's family was immediate and furious. Her brother Bobby Schindler wrote publicly about the segment and called on Fox to cancel Family Guy entirely. The American Life League organized protests. Organizations representing people with brain injuries condemned the episode as mockery of a vulnerable population. MacFarlane's response to criticism of this kind was consistent across his career. He had said publicly about the Parents Television Council, which was among the loudest voices regularly condemning the show, that getting complaints from them was like getting hate mail from Hitler, adding language about the organization that was colorful enough to have been widely quoted since. The pattern that connects all of these episodes, the pulled ones and the controversial ones and the briefly removed ones, is not a pattern of malice or carelessness. The writers of Family Guy have generally known exactly what they were doing and why, even when the results were painful to the people they were depicting. What the pattern reveals is the shape of a particular kind of comedy, one that treats no subject as automatically off-limits and no public event as automatically protected from a joke, and one that sometimes misjudges the distance between the absurdity it is trying to create and the real pain it is standing next to. The show made that miscalculation in different ways at different moments across its history. The Schiavo number was one of those moments. The Turban Cowboy cutaway, innocent when it aired and terrible a month later, was a different kind of moment entirely. What they share is the quality of having produced consequences that the creators did not fully anticipate, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about any piece of comedy that pushes as far as this show has always pushed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 3 has moved through the episodes that frightened Fox, the ones pulled before they aired, and the ones yanked after the world changed around them. But the controversies around Family Guy have never been limited to what was kept off the air. Coming up, the show found itself in actual courtrooms, pursued by music publishers and celebrities who believed the Griffin family had gone too far, in ways that required a judge to settle. Section 4. Lawsuits, legal battles, and the people who fought back. Courtrooms are not where most people expect a cartoon about a Rhode Island family to end up. Animation, by its nature, exists at a remove from reality. The characters are drawn. The world they inhabit is shaped by the logic of jokes rather than the logic of physics. When a real building appears in the background of a Family Guy scene, or a real song plays underneath a cutaway gag, or a real person's face is attached to a punchline, the instinct of most viewers is to receive it as exactly what it appears to be, which is a joke, a reference, a piece of pop culture being recycled through the specific machine of this particular show. Some of the people whose names and likenesses and creative work appeared in that machine did not see it that way. Several of them hired lawyers. The first significant legal challenge came in 2006, and it involved one of the most beloved figures in American entertainment history. Carol Burnett had spent decades building a reputation as one of the warmest and most genuinely beloved performers in television, a comedian whose humor was built on warmth and physical comedy, and a willingness to look ridiculous in the service of making an audience feel good. She had a character called the Charwoman, a cleaning lady in a distinctive costume with a mop, who had appeared regularly on The Carol Burnett Show across its long run. The Charwoman was not just a character, she was a signature, something closely associated with Burnett herself, in the way that very few performers managed to associate themselves with a single image. In April of 2006, Family Guy aired an episode called
called Peterotica, in which Peter Griffin visited an adult entertainment shop. During the episode, a version of the Charwoman appeared, shown mopping the floors of the shop while surrounded by adult merchandise, with an altered version of the theme music from the Carol Burnett show playing underneath the scene. The character was not identified by name, but the visual reference to Burnett's creation was clear enough that anyone familiar with her work would have recognized it immediately. Burnett filed suit against Fox in the spring of 2006, arguing two things. The first was that the use of her Charwoman character without permission constituted copyright infringement, because the character was her original creation, and placing it in a pornographic context without her consent was a violation of her rights over that creation. The second argument was that the use of the altered theme music was a separate infringement, because that music was also protected. She was seeking damages and demanding that the segment be removed from future airings of the episode. Fox's defense rested on the argument that the segment was protected as parody under the First Amendment. Parody occupies a specific and important place in American copyright law. A work that comments on or critiques another work by imitating it is generally allowed to do so without permission from the original creator, because requiring permission would effectively allow creators to suppress criticism of their own work, which courts have consistently held to be against the public interest. The question in the Burnett case was whether what Family Guy had done qualified as genuine parody, meaning commentary on Burnett's original work, or whether it was simply a use of her character for comedic purposes that had nothing to do with commenting on the character itself. The judge who heard the case ruled in favor of Fox. The ruling acknowledged that the segment placed Burnett's character in a context she would have found deeply objectionable, and it acknowledged that the original Charwoman was a more creative and dignified creation than anything Family Guy had done with it. But it held that the use fell within the protections available to parody, and that the First Amendment coverage applied. Burnett lost the case. The segment remained in the episode. She was reported to have been genuinely hurt by the experience, not simply as a legal matter, but as a personal one. A feeling that something she had created with care had been used in a way that was not only disrespectful, but that the legal system had then declined to remedy. The ruling set a precedent that would matter for the next legal challenge, which arrived only months later and involved a different kind of creative property. In October of 2007, a music publisher called Born Company filed suit against Fox over the episode When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, the same episode that had been pulled from broadcast for years over concerns about anti-Semitism. The specific issue in the Born case was the musical number in which Peter sang a parody of When You Wish Upon a Star, the Disney song from the 1940 film Pinocchio. Born Company held the copyright to that song, and the company argued that the Family Guy parody version, titled I Need a Jew, constituted copyright infringement. The lyrics that the parody contained were pointed enough that the case attracted considerable attention. The song expressed Peter's desire for a Jewish financial advisor, using language that was deliberately crude, leaning into the stereotype as a way of satirizing the stereotype. One line in the original version of the musical number referenced the killing of Jesus Christ in a way that Fox itself found uncomfortable, and the line was subsequently changed before the episode was released more widely. The altered version replaced the offending language with something less inflammatory, while keeping the general shape of the joke. Bourne's argument had a specific legal dimension that distinguished it from a straightforward parody defense. The company's lawyers argued that the parody protection available under American copyright law required the work doing the parody to be commenting on the original work itself, rather than simply using the original work as a vehicle for commenting on something else entirely. In the Burnett case, the argument was that Family Guy was commenting on the Charwoman as a character. In the Bourne case, the argument was that the parody of When You Wish Upon a Star was not really about that song at all. Peter was not making fun of the Disney song. He was using the melody and structure of the Disney song to make a joke about Jewish stereotypes. If the parody was not commenting on the original, Bourne argued, then the parody protection should not apply, and the use constituted straightforward infringement. The case went through a year and a half of legal deliberation before a United States district judge ruled in favor of Family Guy and Fox. The ruling held that the episode did not infringe on Bourne's copyright when the lyrics were altered for comedic purposes, and that the parody protection was broad enough to cover what the show had done. Bourne had lost. The episode remained legally intact. McFarlane had made a sardonic public comment about the whole situation in the lead-up to the ruling, saying, before one Adult Swim airing of the episode, that Fox had refused to broadcast it because they felt it was too risky, and that too risky, in their language, meant anything that did not feature a particular celebrity partially unclothed on the hood of a car. The third lawsuit came from a different direction entirely, and involved a figure far less well known to the general public than Carol Burnett. Art Matrano was a comedian an actor who had worked primarily in the 1970s and early 1980s, known for a physical comedy routine in which he pretended to perform magic tricks while humming a specific melody.
The routine was his signature act, something he had developed and performed across many years of television appearances and live shows.
In 2007, a direct-to-DVD Family Guy special called Stewie Griffin: The Untold Story was found to contain a sequence depicting Jesus Christ performing a similar routine, using the same general structure of pretend magic combined with humming. Metrano filed a lawsuit claiming that the sequence was lifted directly from his act, without permission or credit, seeking $2 million in damages. The case had a complicated journey through the legal system. Metrano initially filed in 2007, then withdrew the lawsuit in early 2008, suggesting that he and Fox had reached some kind of informal resolution. Then, in September of 2008, he refiled, apparently because whatever understanding had been reached had not held.
He attempted to register his routine with a copyright office as a way of strengthening his claim, and the Copyright Office declined the registration. In July of 2009, a court rejected Fox's motion to have the case dismissed, ruling that there was enough of a claim to proceed. The case was eventually settled out of court in 2010, with the financial terms kept private. How much Fox paid, if anything, was never disclosed. What these three cases have in common is that they each ran into the same fundamental tension that has always existed around Family Guy's approach to comedy. The show operates by taking real things, real people, real songs, real characters, real cultural artifacts, and running them through a comedic machine that produces something recognizable but distorted, something that relies on the original for its meaning but uses that original in ways the original creator did not intend and would not have approved. This approach is not unique to Family Guy. Parody and cultural commentary have been central to comedy for as long as comedy has existed. What made Family Guy unusual was the industrial scale at which it operated, the speed with which it cycled through references, and the willingness to place those references in contexts that were explicitly adult and often deliberately offensive. The legal system, in the cases of Burnett and Bourne, decided that this approach was protected. The First Amendment coverage for parody was broad enough to include what the show was doing, even when the people whose work was being used found the use hurtful or disrespectful. The Metrano case resulted in a private settlement rather than a ruling, which means it produced no clear legal precedent, but did produce a quiet financial acknowledgement that the claim had some substance worth resolving outside of a courtroom. Beyond the formal lawsuits, the show has attracted a different kind of pushback from individuals and organizations that had no legal recourse, but wanted to make their objections visible. The Parents Television Council, a conservative media watchdog organization, made Family Guy one of its central targets almost from the moment the show premiered. The council placed it on its annual lists of the worst primetime programs for family viewing in multiple years, issued regular statements condemning specific episodes, and organized letter-writing campaigns to Fox and to the Federal Communications Commission, arguing that the show should be investigated for indecency. The FCC received multiple formal petitions requesting that Family Guy be blocked from broadcasting on those grounds. McFarlane's response to the Parents Television Council was characteristically unambiguous. He compared receiving criticism from the organization to receiving hate mail from Hitler, describing its members as rotten to the core, and adding that their organization spent its entire existence hating people while styling itself as a defender of Christian values. He declined to moderate the statement when asked about it subsequently. The relationship between Family Guy and the council settled into a kind of permanent mutual hostility, with the council providing regular condemnation and the show occasionally acknowledging the condemnation and dismissing it with varying degrees of profanity. The Federal Communications Commission complaints produced no successful regulatory action against the show. American broadcast television operates under indecency rules that restrict the most explicit sexual content and profanity, particularly during hours when children are likely to be watching. But Family Guy's specific kind of humor, built on suggestion and reference and the logic of cutaway gags, rather than on explicit depiction, consistently managed to remain within the zone that the FCC's rules covered, without crossing into the territory where those rules could be enforced against it. The complaints were filed and reviewed, and largely went nowhere, which was frustrating to the organizations filing them, and which McFarlane found, by his own account, genuinely amusing. The celebrity lawsuit threat that never quite materialized into a full case involved Sarah Palin, whose daughter Bristol was referenced in an 8th season episode in a context that the Palin family found deeply offensive. The episode depicted a character with Down syndrome who mentioned that her mother was the former governor of Alaska, a reference that Palin and others read as a direct attack on her youngest son Trig, who has Down syndrome. Palin wrote publicly about the episode, calling it a kick in the gut. The voice actor actress who played the character with Down syndrome in the episode, Andrea Faye Friedman, who herself has Down syndrome, responded publicly that she did not find the episode offensive and that she had enjoyed playing the role. The exchange drew considerable media coverage, but did not produce a lawsuit. What the accumulated legal history of Family Guy reveals is something that the show's critics and its defenders would both probably agree on, which is that the program has spent its entire existence operating at the edge of what the legal system and the broadcasting system will permit. The cases it has lost, the one involving Carol Burnett specifically, were limited to a ruling that its conduct was within the law, not to a ruling that its conduct was admirable or respectful. The cases it has won have confirmed the legal protection without endorsing the creative choices. The settlements have buried the financial details and left the creative questions unresolved. The show kept making the same kinds of jokes. The network kept broadcasting them, with occasional exceptions. The lawyers kept being paid, and the audience kept watching through all of it, in numbers large enough to sustain the show through 2 cancellations and multiple courtroom battles, and decades of organized opposition from groups who believed very sincerely that what was happening on Sunday nights on Fox was harmful to the culture they were trying to protect. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 4 has moved through the courtrooms and the letter-writing campaigns and the legal battles that followed Family Guy across its history. But the controversies the show attracted were not limited to what other people brought to it from the outside. Some of the strangest and most debated moments in the show's story came from inside it, from choices the writers made about their own characters. And none of those choices produced a reaction quite like what happened the afternoon a beloved dog was hit by a car. Section 5. The dog died and the internet lost its mind. Rain or shine, week after week, for more than a decade, Brian Griffin had been the steadiest presence in a household full of unsteady people. He was the one who could hold a conversation. He was the one who noticed when something was wrong before anyone else did. He drank martinis and read novels and harbored ambitions that the world consistently declined to reward. And his friendship with Stewie, the small maniacal infant who lived 2 doors down the hallway, had produced some of the most warmly received episodes in the show's entire run. For millions of viewers, Brian was not a supporting character. He was the character, the axis around which the more chaotic elements of the Griffin household rotated, the reliable point of return after every cutaway and every digression, and every episode in which Peter did something catastrophic and the family had to recover from it. On November 24th, 2013, a Sunday evening during the 12th season, Brian Griffin was struck by a car while playing street hockey with Stewie outside the Griffin house. He was carried inside. He said goodbye to the family members gathered around him. He told Stewie he had had a wonderful life and that he was grateful, and then he died. The scene lasted only a few minutes of screen time. By the standards of what Family Guy normally asked of its audience emotionally, it was restrained and genuinely sad, without the cutaway gags or the tonal pivot that the show usually deployed when it wanted to avoid sitting with something difficult. The AV Club reviewer who covered the episode gave it an A- and called Brian's death scene actually pretty poignant, as close as Family Guy could come to genuinely moving. The reviewer described the handling as surprisingly effective at dealing with the sudden death of a main character. These were not the words critics usually reached for when writing about this particular show. Within hours of the episode airing, the internet had begun to respond in a way that surprised everyone involved in making it. A petition appeared on change.org addressed to Seth MacFarlane and Fox, demanding that Brian Griffin be brought back. The petition gathered signatures at a rate that the platform described as extraordinary, reaching tens of thousands within the first day and continuing to climb. The language of the petition was straightforward and unironic. It described Brian as an important part of the viewing experience, said that he had added a witty and sophisticated element to the show, and warned that Family Guy and Fox would lose viewers if he was not restored to life. People who had never signed a petition about a political candidate or a social cause were adding their names to a document asking a television network to resurrect a cartoon dog. Some viewers went further. Reports emerged of people obtaining tattoos in memory of Brian Griffin, including memorial ink bearing the words R.I.P. Brian. Others posted lengthy tributes on social media platforms, writing about what the character had meant to them personally, describing the loss in terms that would have been more recognizable in an obituary than in a reaction to a television episode. The emotional investment that the response revealed was striking not just in its intensity, but in its apparent sincerity. These were not people performing grief for comic effect. They were people who had genuinely lost something, or felt that they had, and who were expressing that loss in whatever way seemed most immediate. The Griffin family, in the episodes that followed Brian's death, adopted a new dog. His name was Vinny, and he was voiced by Tony Serino
Sirico, the actor best known for playing the mobster Paulie Walnuts in The Sopranos. The casting was Seth MacFarlane's idea, born out of genuine admiration for Sirico and a desire to build a character around the specific texture of his voice and personality. Vinny was warm and loyal and spoke with a thick Italian-American accent, and he was deeply, unmistakably not Brian. The writers had constructed him carefully, giving him a history and a personality and a genuine connection to the family. But the viewers who were looking for Brian did not find him in Vinny, and were not particularly interested in finding something else. Sirico had signed a 6-episode deal with an option for more, a contractual arrangement that was later read as evidence that the production had not firmly decided whether Brian's death would be permanent. The option suggested flexibility, the possibility that the show was waiting to see how the audience responded before committing to a direction. In the weeks after the episode aired, that reading seemed plausible. The petition was still climbing. MacFarlane had said publicly that he was surprised by the strength of the fan reaction, and that the surprise was, in his words, a good kind of surprise, an indication that people still cared enough about the character to be that angry. A showrunner saying the reaction was a good kind of surprise is not the statement of someone who is absolutely committed to the decision that produced the reaction. The answer came on December 15th, 2013, 3 weeks after Brian's death and 2 days before Christmas. The episode was called Christmas Guy, and it found Stewie at a holiday carnival, miserable without his closest companion, missing Brian in the specific way that a highly intelligent and emotionally isolated child misses the one relationship that has ever fully worked for him. While at the carnival, Stewie encountered a version of his past self, a Stewie from an earlier episode who was carrying the time machine device that the present Stewie no longer possessed, having destroyed it in the same episode where Brian died. The encounter gave Stewie access to the technology he needed. He traveled back to the moment before Brian was struck by the car. He pushed Brian out of the way. Brian survived. The timeline restored itself. Vinny was gone, quietly erased from a history that had been rewritten around him. Brian Griffin was back at the table for Christmas dinner, alive and entirely unaware of what had almost happened. The response to the resurrection was, predictably, complicated. The viewers who had signed the petition and gotten the tattoos and posted the tributes were relieved, and many of them expressed that relief in the same public forums where they had expressed their grief. But there was also a significant current of frustration, directed not at the death, but at the speed of the reversal. The argument that emerged from this current was that if Brian could be brought back 3 weeks after his death, then the death had never been real in any meaningful sense. It had been a stunt, a ratings play, a way of generating exactly the kind of attention and conversation and online petition activity that had duly arrived, packaged as genuine storytelling. Some viewers felt manipulated. Some critics agreed with them. MacFarlane's own public comments in the weeks and months after the revival did little to settle the question. He had said at one point that the death was always planned to be followed by a resurrection, and that the audience should have trusted the writers to bring the character back eventually. He later appeared to suggest, in a different context, that the fan reaction had been a factor in the decision. Some observers who followed the situation closely noted that the production timeline for animated television, in which episodes are typically completed months before they air, made it technically possible that the Christmas Guy episode had been in production before the November episode even aired, which would suggest the resurrection was planned rather than reactive. Others pointed out that Sirico's 6-episode deal with an option for more did not sound like the contract structure of a show that had a firm resurrection date already on the calendar. The most honest answer is probably that the truth sits somewhere in a complicated middle. The production of an animated show does not happen the way the production of a live-action show happens. Scripts are written, recorded, and animated across overlapping timelines, and the decisions made at one stage can be adjusted at later stages more easily than is possible with filmed content. It is entirely plausible that the writers had a resurrection broadly in mind, while still leaving themselves the flexibility to read the audience's response before committing to the specific episode and timing. What is not plausible is that the death was intended to be permanent. Tony Sirico is not the kind of actor a show puts on a 6-episode deal when it genuinely believes it is building a permanent new direction. What the whole episode, taken together, revealed about the relationship between Family Guy and its audience was more interesting than the specific question of whether the death was planned or reactive. Brian Griffin had been a character on a cartoon for 14 years. He had never been real in any physical sense. He had never existed outside of drawings and voice recordings and the imaginations of the people who watched him. And yet, his apparent death had produced a response that, in its scale and emotional authenticity, resembled the response to a genuine loss. People had cried, people had gotten tattoos, people had signed their names to a legal document. The strength of that response was a measure not of how irrational
professional the audience was, but of how successfully the show had, over 14 years, made Brian feel like someone worth caring about. McFarlane said in January of 2014 that the reaction had surprised all of them, in a good way, and that the intensity of the feeling demonstrated that people still had a real connection to the character. He was right about that. What he perhaps did not fully account for was the second wave of the reaction, the one that came not from grief, but from the feeling of having been played, the suspicion that the grief had been manufactured by people who knew all along that Brian would be back in time for Christmas, and who had nonetheless asked the audience to feel something that the show itself did not intend to honor. The Brian death arc sits in the show's history as a genuinely revealing moment, not because of what it says about the writer's intentions, which remain somewhat ambiguous, but because of what it says about the audience and the strange emotional contracts that long-running fictional worlds create between the people who make them and the people who watch them. A show that runs for 12 seasons before killing a major character has, by that point, accumulated a weight of attachment that it cannot simply deploy for the purposes of a surprise and then dissolve 3 weeks later without cost. The cost was real, even if Brian was not, and the show carried it forward into its later seasons in the form of a slightly altered relationship with the audience that had once trusted it completely. Vinny appeared in a small number of additional episodes after Brian's return, voiced still by Sariko, before quietly fading out of the show's world. The character had been built with genuine care and performed with real warmth, and in a different version of events, one where the audience had accepted the change and the show had committed to it, Vinny might have grown into something interesting. Instead, he became a footnote, a few episodes in a long series, remembered primarily as the temporary replacement for someone the audience refused to replace. Brian Griffin continues to appear in Family Guy to this day, drinking his martinis and failing to finish his novel, and maintaining his improbable friendship with the infant who once tried to use a time machine to save his life. The death has been referenced occasionally in later episodes, sometimes played for comedy, sometimes acknowledged as a genuinely strange period in the show's history. The petition is still findable online if someone knows where to look. The tattoos, presumably, are still there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Brian's death and resurrection is one of the most emotionally charged chapters in this story, but it is far from the only moment where the show's writers made choices that the audience refused to simply absorb and move on from. The section coming up turns to the character who has perhaps absorbed more from the audience, and from the Griffin family itself, than anyone else in Quahog, and to the strange, layered, and genuinely uncomfortable question of what the show has always been doing with Meg. Section 6, The Girl Nobody Wanted, and what the show did with her. Somewhere in the first few seasons, quietly and without much announcement, Family Guy made a decision about its eldest daughter that would define her existence for the better part of 2 decades. The decision was not made in a single writer's room conversation or a single script note. It accumulated gradually, one episode at a time, one joke at a time, until it had settled into something so fixed and so recognizable that it became one of the show's most debated running elements. The decision was simply this: Meg Griffin would be the person that everyone, including her own family, treated as fundamentally not worth caring about. Megan Griffin was there from the very beginning. She appeared in the pilot episode that aired after the Super Bowl in January of 1999. A teenager with brown hair and glasses, and the specific social anxiety of someone who desperately wants to fit in and cannot quite figure out how. In those first episodes, she was a recognizable type, the awkward adolescent daughter navigating the ordinary humiliations of high school, while belonging to a family that added extraordinary humiliations on top of the ordinary ones. She was voiced in the first season by Lacey Chabert, an actress who had found real success on the drama Party of Five, and who brought a specific quality of earnest vulnerability to the role. The character in those early episodes was not a punching bag. She was embarrassed by her family, which was reasonable given the family, and she wanted things she could not have, which is the condition of most teenagers in most television shows. Chabert left after the first season. The reasons given were scheduling conflicts with Party of Five and the demands of her schoolwork, and the departure was handled without particular drama. Mila Kunis auditioned for the role and was called back multiple times. McFarlane instructed her during the callback process to speak more slowly and to enunciate more carefully, coaching that Kunis later described as somewhat confusing because she was not entirely sure what was being asked of her. She was hired anyway. McFarlane said that he felt she had a very natural quality in the role, and that her work on That 70s Show, where she had demonstrated an ability to command a scene without overshadowing the people around her, suggested she would be right for Meg. Kunis has voiced the character ever since, across more than 20 seasons and hundreds of episodes, making her one of the longest-serving members of a cast that has remained remarkably stable. The shift in how the character was written did not happen immediately after Kunis took over. The early seasons still gave Meg storylines with genuine emotional stakes. Episodes where she wanted a boyfriend, or tried to join a group at school, or struggled with the feeling of being invisible in a world that kept looking past her. She was a recognizable teenage girl, drawn with broad strokes, but recognizable nonetheless. The character worked in those episodes because the humor around her was observational rather than punitive.
The audience laughed at the situations Meg found herself in, not at Meg herself. Somewhere around the 4th season, after the revival, the balance shifted. The jokes about Meg being unwanted became more frequent and more extreme. Peter began hitting her more openly, dismissing her more completely, treating her presence in a room as an inconvenience rather than a fact of family life. The school scenes grew crueler. The romantic storylines became more desperate and more humiliating. By the middle seasons of the show, the character had been reduced to something that the internet eventually gave its own shorthand: a punching bag, a figure whose entire function in the narrative was to absorb abuse from every direction and keep returning for more. The directions from which the abuse came were comprehensive. Peter hit her, ignored her, and told her openly that he did not particularly enjoy her company. Lois was subtler, but not significantly kinder. Chris and Stewie treated her with contempt, calibrated to their respective ages and personalities. At school, she was bullied by the popular girl Connie D'Amico with a consistency that suggested genuine institutional cruelty rather than the ordinary social jostling of high school. Even Brian, the most reliably reasonable member of the household, had episodes in which his treatment of Meg was notably unkind. Quagmire's recurring joke about asking whether she was 18 yet functioned as a dark counterpoint to the general abuse, suggesting that the only adult male neighbor interested in Meg at all was interested in the most predatory way imaginable. The writers were aware of what they were doing. The awareness is visible in an episode from the 9th season called Seahorse Seashell Party, which is perhaps the most honest thing the show ever did with Meg's character, and which remains quietly devastating even by the standards of a show not known for restraint. The episode takes place during a hurricane, with the Griffin family confined to the house together while Brian takes hallucinogenic mushrooms and Meg, trapped in close quarters with the people who have mistreated her longest, finally breaks. She turns on her family one by one and tells them what she thinks of them with a clarity and precision that the show had never previously allowed her. She tells Peter he is a fat, lazy, stupid alcoholic who compensates for his own failures by making everyone around him feel small. She tells Chris that he has absorbed every one of his father's worst qualities without developing any of his father's limited social skills. She tells Lois that she is a vain and selfish woman who has spent Meg's entire life treating her as a prop. The family, exposed and accused, begins to fall apart. They turn on each other. The household, deprived of its shared target, loses the mechanism that has been keeping its internal conflicts from erupting. And then Meg watches this happening and makes a choice. She takes it back. She apologizes. She tells her family that she understands her role, that she absorbs their anger so that they do not have to absorb each other's, that she is the pressure valve for a household that would destroy itself without one. She accepts the abuse not because she cannot see it, but because she has concluded that accepting it is the only way to hold the family together. The episode ends with the family restored to something like equilibrium, with Meg reinstated as the person everyone takes for granted, and with the audience left to sit with the specific discomfort of having watched a cartoon character arrive at a genuine and coherent understanding of her own suffering, and then choose to continue suffering anyway. It is an unusual thing for a comedy to do. It is an even more unusual thing for Family Guy specifically to do, a show whose general posture toward its own darker elements is to make a joke and move on. Seahorse Seashell Party does not make a joke and move on. It makes a joke and then sits very quietly in what the joke has revealed. The question of why Meg exists in this form, why the show chose to make one of its central characters a permanent victim, has attracted more analytical attention than almost any other element of the series. Various explanations have been offered. One is purely structural. Every ensemble comedy needs a character who can absorb the consequences of the chaos that the other characters generate, and Meg is that character, the one who pays for Peter's decisions and Stewie's experiments and Brian's pretensions. Another is that
Meg functions as a surrogate for the audience, the ordinary person trapped inside an extraordinary and frequently hostile situation, the viewer's representative in a world where everyone else has a superpower, or a personality disorder, or a hidden intelligence. A third explanation, offered by MacFarlane himself in interviews, is that Meg was inspired in part by his own feeling of being an outsider during his teenage years, the sense of not fitting in and not being able to explain why. The fan theory landscape around Meg has produced some genuinely dark readings of her situation. One widely circulated theory suggests that the entire world of Family Guy is a hallucination occurring inside Peter Griffin's mind as he sits in a psychiatric institution following some unspecified breakdown, and that within this hallucination, Meg is the character he punishes most severely because she represents the part of himself he most despises. Another theory holds that Meg is actually the sanest and most perceptive member of her family, and that her abuse is the show's way of commenting on how institutions, including the family, treat people who see through their pretenses. Neither of these theories is endorsed by the show itself, but they have circulated widely enough to become part of the conversation around the character. What is supported by the show is a version of Meg that has more dimension than the punching bag label suggests, and that dimension is most visible in the episodes that the show treats as Meg episodes specifically. In Peter's Daughter, she falls in love with a medical student after a coma, an episode that gives her a genuine romantic arc, even if it ends, as Meg's romantic arcs tend to end, in humiliation. In Quagmire and Meg, she finds an unexpected friendship with a neighbor whose jokes about her age have always been among the show's darker running gags, before the family intervenes, because they understand what Quagmire's friendships with women typically lead to. In Don't Make Me Over, she discovers a talent for singing and briefly becomes famous, before the episode dismantles her success in the way that Meg's successes are always dismantled. Lacey Chabert returned, in a sense, for a 10th season episode called Back to the Pilot, in which Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the events of the first episode. The production used archival recordings of Chabert's original voice work so that the Meg of the past spoke in the voice of the first season, while the Meg of the present spoke in Kunis's voice. The episode did not draw attention to the difference explicitly, but it was audible to anyone who had been watching long enough to remember. Kunis herself has spoken about the character with a kind of affectionate pragmatism. She described Meg as the middle child of the show, the one who is constantly in the state of being an awkward 16-year-old going through puberty, and said that the abuse was funny in the way that the middle child dynamic is funny, an observation that reveals something about the specific cultural register the character occupies. The middle child comparison is apt not just as a description of Meg's position in the family, but as a description of her position in the audience's emotional relationship with the show. She is not the favorite. She is not the one people quote. She is the one who is always there and always overlooked, and whom the show occasionally turns to face directly, with results that are more affecting than the rest of the run would lead anyone to expect. The writer's decision in 2014 to begin gradually walking back the most extreme elements of Meg's treatment was not announced as a formal policy change, but the shift is visible across later seasons. Peter reconciled with her in meaningful ways in the middle teams of the show's run. Stewie, whose early contempt for Meg was casual and total, developed something closer to a sibling relationship with her by the later seasons, the two of them occasionally on the same side of a situation for the first time. The punching bag dynamic did not disappear entirely, and there were seasons where it briefly returned to something like its earlier intensity, but the show's center of gravity around the character had moved. Mila Kunis, for her part, stayed. She stayed through the worst of the abuse years and the gradual rehabilitation years, and the seasons where the character was handled well and the seasons where she was not. She stayed while the show was canceled, and while it was revived, and while it became one of the longest-running animated series in television history. The role of Meg Griffin is not the role that defines her career, in the way that Jackie Burkhart on That 70s Show, or her film work has defined it, but it is the role she has performed most consistently over the longest period of time, and that consistency is its own kind of testimony to something, if not to the character's dignity exactly, then to the patience of the person who has given her a voice for more than 2 decades. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Meg's story is one of endurance within the show's world, but the story of the show's world itself has always been shaped by the man at its center, and that man carries a real-life history stranger than anything the writers have put on screen. Coming up, the morning Seth MacFarlane overslept, the flight he was supposed to be on, and the 10 minutes that kept Family Guy alive before it had finished its second season. Section 7, The Hangover That Changed Everything.
September 10th, 2001 was a Monday, and Seth MacFarlane had spent the evening giving a lecture at his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design, the place where he had made the student film that eventually became Family Guy. After the lecture, he had gone out with some of the faculty, as people do after an evening of that kind, and he had stayed out later than he had planned, and he had drunk more than he should have given what he had scheduled for the following morning. What he had scheduled for the following morning was a flight from Boston to Los Angeles, American Airlines Flight 11, departing at 7:45 in the morning. He was booked on it. His name was on the manifest. He had a seat. He overslept.
The combination of factors that kept him off that plane has been described by MacFarlane in several interviews across the years since, and the telling has remained consistent. He was hungover from the night before. His travel agent had also made an error, listing the departure time on his itinerary as 8:15 rather than 7:45, a discrepancy of 30 minutes that compounded the problem the hangover had already created. By the time MacFarlane arrived at the airport and reached the check-in counter, the gate had closed. The woman behind the counter told him he was too late. He accepted this, went to the airport lounge, sat down in a chair, and fell asleep. He woke up approximately 45 minutes later to commotion. Other people in the lounge were gathered around a television screen. The first plane had already struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. MacFarlane sat in his chair and watched the second plane hit. And then, as the news reports began identifying the flights involved, he heard the number of the flight he had been booked on and understood what he was looking at. American Airlines Flight 11 had been the first aircraft, the one that had struck the North Tower. All 92 people aboard had been killed. He had been booked on that flight. He had missed it by approximately 10 minutes. He told the person sitting next to him in the lounge what had just happened. His assistant, who had received a message that MacFarlane was taking a different flight, did not get that message until 20 minutes after the attacks had already begun, leaving a brief window during which people who knew MacFarlane's travel plans had reason to believe he might have been on the plane. The family and colleagues who heard about the itinerary before they heard from MacFarlane himself experienced a version of the fear that the families of the actual victims experienced, compressed into a shorter time frame and resolved in the other direction. MacFarlane was not the only person with connections to the entertainment world who had been scheduled on Flight 11 and had not boarded it for reasons unrelated to foreknowledge of what was going to happen. Mark Wahlberg, who would later co-star with MacFarlane in the Ted films, had been booked on the same flight and had changed his plans at the last minute when an invitation to the Toronto Film Festival arrived and he chartered a private plane instead. Wahlberg later made a public comment suggesting that if he had been on the flight, the outcome might have been different, a statement that drew significant backlash and required a public apology. MacFarlane made no such suggestion. He talked about the experience with a kind of quiet gratitude that does not reach for meaning it has not earned. The flight that MacFarlane missed was carrying people whose names deserved to be noted alongside his survival. Among the passengers were David Angel, the creator of the television series Frasier, and his wife Lynn. Barry Berenson, an actress and photographer, was also on board. The oldest victim of the September 11th attacks, a man named Robert Grant Norton, who was 85 years old, was on Flight 11. 92 people in total were killed when the aircraft struck the North Tower at 8:46 in the morning. MacFarlane had been in the airport lounge for less than an hour when it happened. He had been on that plane's passenger list the night before. Family Guy had been canceled for the first time in May of 2000, more than a year before September 11th, and had been reprieved and given a third season by the time the attacks occurred. The show was in production on its third season when MacFarlane overslept in Boston. Had he boarded that flight, Family Guy would have lost its creator at a moment when the show was already fighting for its survival, already being moved around the schedule, and losing the ratings battles that would eventually produce its second and final cancellation in 2002. The revival in 2005, the DVD sales, the Adult Swim ratings, the decades of subsequent episodes, all of it threads back through a single morning in September when a man with a hangover arrived at an airport 10 minutes too late. MacFarlane has spoken about the experience without dramatizing it, which is the only honest way to speak about something like that. He described it as a strange thing to carry, the knowledge of what he had almost been part of, and he noted that the appropriate response to surviving something by accident is not to treat the survival as meaningful in itself, but simply to be grateful and to continue working. He continued working. The third season of Family Guy aired in the fall of 2001, into the changed atmosphere of a country still processing what had happened, and the show's willingness to eventually make jokes about those events, carefully and then less carefully as the years passed, became its own kind of controversy. The show's relationship with September 11th and its aftermath was complicated and extended well beyond a single episode or a single joke. In the season 10 episode, Back to the Pilot, Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the events of the first Family Guy episode, which aired in 1999. While
While there, Brian discovers that he knows the September 11th attacks are coming and faces the question of whether to warn people. He does warn people. The attacks are prevented. The episode then follows the consequences of that prevention, which include a series of events so catastrophic, including a second American Civil War, that Brian and Stewie conclude the only responsible course of action is to travel back again and allow September 11th to happen. It is a genuinely strange piece of television, the kind of episode that only a show with more than a decade of established goodwill could attempt, and it sits in the catalog as one of the more unusual things American network comedy has ever put on screen. Earlier, and more quietly, the show had already brushed against the subject in a different way. An episode from the second season, called Road to Rhode Island, contained a cutaway gag that included a depiction of Osama bin Laden going through airport security. The episode aired in 2000, more than a year before the attacks, when bin Laden was a known figure but not yet the defining face of a generation's worst day. After September 11th, the bin Laden cutaway was removed from the episode for subsequent airings and from the original DVD release. It was a small edit, the kind of thing that happens quietly and without announcement, but it placed Family Guy in the same category as several other pieces of American entertainment that had to be adjusted after the world they existed in suddenly changed. MacFarlane's own feelings about September 11th and his near miss were visible in the show's content in ways that were sometimes subtle and sometimes not. The willingness to engage with the subject at all, to make episodes that addressed the attacks directly, rather than simply pretending they had not happened, reflected something about how MacFarlane processed difficult material. He had always used the show as a vehicle for the things he actually thought about, the political positions he held, the events he found himself unable to stop thinking about, the cultural phenomena he found absurd or frightening or worth examining. September 11th was the largest event of his adult life, and he had been closer to it, physically and temporally, than almost anyone who was not in New York or Washington or Pennsylvania that morning. The lecture he gave at RISD the night before the attacks has been referenced as a detail in his own telling of the story, and it is a detail worth pausing on. He went back to the school where he had made the film that became Family Guy, gave a lecture about his career to students who were studying what he had once studied, went out for drinks with the faculty afterwards, stayed too late, slept too little, and woke up the next morning slightly behind schedule. The chain of events is so ordinary, so recognizable as the shape of any late evening followed by an early morning, that its outcome is disorienting to think about. The 10 minutes it cost him were not dramatic minutes. They were the minutes of a man moving slightly more slowly than he needed to be moving, fumbling for his keys, checking his bag one more time at the door. Beyond the personal dimensions of the story, the near miss on Flight 11 has become a fixed point in the popular mythology around Family Guy, the kind of fact that gets cited when people want to argue that the show's existence was improbable, that its survival was contingent on accidents and coincidences that had nothing to do with creative merit or audience demand. This reading is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete. MacFarlane survived. The show survived its cancellations. The audience found it on Adult Swim and bought the DVDs, and petitioned for the dog to come back to life. Each of those survivals had its own logic, its own combination of luck and stubbornness, and the basic human tendency to hold on to things that have given genuine pleasure. What makes the Flight 11 story sit differently from the other improbabilities in Family Guy's history is that it is not a story about the show at all. It is a story about a man who was almost killed before the show he made had finished its second season, before the first cancellation had fully resolved, before the DVD sales and the Adult Swim numbers and the revival and the 2 decades of subsequent television that followed. The show's story and the creator's story run parallel to each other for most of the show's life, but on the morning of September 11th, 2001, they briefly converged on a point that was not about animation or ratings or network schedules, but simply about whether Seth MacFarlane was going to be alive the following day. He was. He took the 11 o'clock flight to Los Angeles instead, and he arrived in a city and a country that were already different from the ones he had left that morning, and he went back to work on the 3rd season of a show that was about to be canceled for the second and final time, not knowing yet that it would come back, not knowing yet that the dog would die and return, and that the eldest daughter would be mistreated across a decade of episodes, and that the baby's voice would eventually become one of the most recognized voices on American television. He went back to work because that is what he did, and the work continued, and the show continued, and the fact of what had almost happened that morning settled into the background of everything that came after, present but not spoken of in every episode, in every voice he recorded in his kitchen or his studio, in every joke the writers put in the mouth of a character built on the voice of a security guard he once overheard at a school in Rhode Island. The near miss on Flight 11 is the kind of story that resists resists the meaning people want to assign to it. It was not a sign. It was not a message. It was a hangover and a travel agent's error and a gate that closed 10 minutes before a man reached the counter. What it produced was more Family Guy, more Stewie and Brian and Peter and Meg and Quahog, more cutaway gags and musical numbers and banned episodes and court cases and fan petitions.
Whether that is a satisfying outcome to assign to such a morning is a question that each person watching has to answer for themselves. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That Morning in Boston is one of the stranger true stories attached to any long-running television show, but the show itself has generated its own catalog of moments that seemed to reach outside the boundaries of fiction. Coming up, the jokes that came true, the throwaway lines that resurfaced years later when the world caught up to them, and what the people who wrote them say about how that actually happened. Section 8. The jokes that came true. Comedy writers spend a great deal of time thinking about things that other people prefer not to think about. The work requires a certain willingness to follow an idea to its logical end, to ask what would happen if a particular rumor were true, or what the most uncomfortable version of a given situation would look like, or what a person who behaved consistently with their worst tendencies would eventually do. Most of the time, this process produces jokes that are merely edgy or merely dark, jokes that live and die within the context of the episode and leave no trace in the world outside. Occasionally, with a frequency that has made Family Guy the subject of a specific and recurring online conversation, the process produces something that turns out to be not merely a joke at all. The most widely circulated example began in the 4th season, in an episode that aired in 2005. The episode contained a scene in which Stewie Griffin, the infant with the British accent and the history of elaborate schemes, ran naked through a crowded shopping mall in a state of obvious panic. He was screaming for help. The specific words he was screaming were that he had escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement. The joke was a throwaway, a few seconds of screen time, a cutaway gag built on a rumor that was apparently circulating in certain circles at the time, a rumor about the Academy Award-winning actor that the writers had heard and found usable as a punchline. McFarlane later said he had not personally heard the rumor when the joke was pitched to him in the writer's room, and that it had to be explained by the colleagues who brought it forward. He approved it, it aired, it was forgotten by most of the people who watched it. 12 years passed. In October of 2017, the actor Anthony Rapp came forward publicly with an account of an encounter with Kevin Spacey that had occurred in 1986, when Rapp was 14 years old. Rapp described Spacey making sexual advances toward him at a party. Spacey issued a public statement in response that acknowledged the account while claiming not to remember it, and simultaneously used the statement to announce publicly that he was gay, a conflation that drew immediate and widespread criticism. In the days and weeks that followed Rapp's account, additional men came forward with similar stories. 8 people who had worked with Spacey on the Netflix series House of Cards made claims against him. The accumulation of allegations was substantial and serious. Within hours of Rapp's initial account becoming public, the 12-year-old Family Guy clip resurfaced on social media. The image of baby Stewie running through a mall screaming about Kevin Spacey's basement was shared tens of thousands of times, presented as evidence that Family Guy had predicted or foreseen or somehow known what Spacey was. The clip moved through the internet with a specific velocity of things that feel revelatory, things that seem to confirm a suspicion that the world has a hidden coherence that is occasionally glimpsed through cracks in ordinary life. McFarlane addressed the situation during Fox's portion of the Television Critics Association press tour in early 2018. His response was careful and slightly impatient, the response of someone who had been asked the same question in several different forms and had arrived at a settled position on it. He said that the myth that Family Guy was a Kreskin-like prognosticator of these kinds of scandals was a little sensationalized, and that the more accurate description was that the show's writers had always had very open ears. The writer's room was a place where rumors were currency, where things that people had heard from people who had heard them from other people were treated as potentially usable material. Not because those rumors were assumed to be true, but because the possibility they represented was comedically useful. The joke about Spacey's basement was not a prediction. It was a rumor that turned out to be something closer to the truth than anyone in that writer's room had assumed it was when they used it. Executive producer Alex Sulkin, who was present when the joke was pitched, offered a slightly different frame. He noted that the show's episodes were vetted by a legal standards department, and that, for a joke to survive that vetting process, it needed to have either some basis in verifiable fact, or to be so clearly absurd that no reasonable person could take it as a factual claim. The Spacey joke had apparently satisfied one of those conditions at the time it was reviewed, episode, which suggested that the rumor behind it had some grounding that the legal department considered sufficient. This was not the same as saying the joke was a prediction. It was saying that the joke was not entirely without basis, which is a different and more complicated thing. The Kevin Spacey example was the most prominent instance of the phenomenon, but it was not the only one. Brett Ratner, the film director who faced multiple allegations of sexual harassment and assault beginning in 2017, had appeared in a 2012 Family Guy episode in a context that was, in retrospect, uncomfortably specific. The episode depicted Ratner bidding on Stewie at what appeared to be a sex auction. The joke had the same structure as the Spacey one, a rumor translated into a cutaway gag, filed past the legal department, and aired without the writers knowing whether or how the rumor might eventually be confirmed. Several years later, it was confirmed in ways that made the joke feel less like a joke. McFarlane's relationship with the Harvey Weinstein scandal was different from his relationship with the Spacey and Ratner jokes, and he distinguished between them publicly. The Weinstein connection came not from a Family Guy episode, but from a joke McFarlane made while hosting the Academy Awards in 2013. During the ceremony, announcing the nominees for Best Supporting Actress, he said that the 5 nominated actresses no longer had to pretend to be attracted to Harvey Weinstein. The joke landed to uncomfortable laughter and was largely forgotten by the people in the room within minutes. 4 years later, when the New York Times published an investigation into Weinstein's decades of alleged sexual misconduct and the entertainment industry began the reckoning that followed, the clip of McFarlane's joke resurfaced. McFarlane was explicit about where this one came from. He said he had a very good friend who had experienced a troubling encounter with Weinstein, and that he despised the man for direct and personal reasons. The Oscars joke was not a rumor processed through a comedy filter. It was a deliberate and targeted statement made in the most public form available to him, dressed as a joke because a joke was the only form in which such a statement could be made in that room on that night without stopping the proceedings entirely. He had known something specific. He had said something specific. The gap between what he said and what the rest of the world knew at that moment was the gap that makes the clip, viewed after 2017, feel like a warning rather than a joke. The Boston Marathon connection, which arose from the same Turban Cowboy episode that was pulled from Fox and Hulu after the 2013 bombing, occupied a different category from the Spacey and Weinstein material. The cutaway gag showing Peter driving through the Boston Marathon crowd was not built on a rumor about a specific person's behavior. It was a piece of cartoon violence using a specific real-world location for comedic purposes. The fact that a real attack occurred at that location approximately 1 month after the episode aired was not a case of the show knowing something. It was a coincidence. A terrible one, the kind that makes people reach for explanations because the alternative, that some things simply happen in proximity to each other without connection, is harder to sit with than the idea of hidden patterns. A hoax that circulated after the bombing made the situation worse. Someone edited footage from the Turban Cowboy episode together with footage from a different episode in a way designed to suggest that Family Guy had depicted the bombing with specific detail, including the explosions themselves. The edited clip spread rapidly and was believed by a significant number of people before it was identified as fabricated. McFarlane condemned the hoax directly and publicly, calling it despicable, and noting that the actual episode, offensive as some found it, bore no resemblance to what the edited clip implied. Fox had already pulled the episode from its platforms by the time the hoax was circulating widely. Beyond the scandal predictions, the show has produced a category of cultural coincidences that are less dark but equally striking to people who catalog them. A season 7 episode from 2009 contained a scene in which Stewie made a reference to Bruce Jenner as an elegant, beautiful Dutch woman, a description that read at the time as a simple oddity, and that read very differently after 2015, when Jenner publicly transitioned and became Caitlyn Jenner. A later episode depicted Jenner as a flamboyant performer. McFarlane and the writers have not claimed credit for foreseeing a private person's journey. The jokes existed before the public announcement of that journey, which places them in the category of things that were simultaneously more innocent and more prescient than they appeared at the time of airing. The Robin Williams connection was the kind of coincidence that has no comfortable explanation and does not particularly need one. An episode of Family Guy in which a storyline touched on themes of suicide was airing on BBC 3 in the United Kingdom on a specific evening in 2014. The episode concluded. The news broke immediately afterward that Robin Williams had died by suicide at his home in California. The timing was precise enough to be genuinely disturbing to people who encountered it. A piece of entertainment about one thing, playing out while the real version of that thing was happening somewhere else. McFarlane did not claim this as a prediction. Nobody with any credibility did. It was simply a collision of timing that the world happened to produce. What makes the accumulated pattern interesting, beyond the individual examples, is what it reveals about the specific mechanism of the Family Guy writer's room as a creative environment. The room was a place where people paid close attention to the world they were living in, including the parts of that world that more decorous entertainments preferred to pretend did not exist. It was a place where rumors about powerful people were treated as material rather than as gossip to be protected from public exposure. It was a place that operated by legal necessity with a degree of factual grounding even for its most outrageous jokes, which meant that the jokes had a kind of tether to reality that purely invented material does not. The combination of close attention, low inhibition, and legal vetting produced over 20-plus seasons a body of work that brushed against the actual truth of actual situations more often than probability alone would predict. McFarlane's own description of how the room worked is instructive. He said the writers had always had very open ears, a phrase that covers a great deal. Open ears means listening to rumors. It means taking seriously the things that people whisper about powerful figures in an industry where the powerful figures are highly visible and their behavior is observed by large numbers of people who generally do not feel safe describing what they have observed. Comedy has always been one of the few spaces where things that cannot be said directly can be said obliquely, dressed as a joke, sent out into the world under cover of absurdity. Family Guy exploited that space more systematically and over a longer period than almost any other show in American television, which is part of why the jokes that came true look, in retrospect, like something more than accidents. The writers themselves have been consistently reluctant to accept the credit that the internet periodically offers them. Sulkin and McFarlane and the other producers who have spoken about specific examples have maintained the same basic position across every interview on the subject. The jokes were built on rumors, the rumors turned out to have substance, and the outcome reflects the quality of their information rather than any predictive ability. This is a reasonable position. It is also, perhaps, a slightly modest one. A writer's room that consistently heard the right rumors, knew which ones were worth using, and processed them into comedy that survived legal review, was doing something more than accidentally overhearing things. It was functioning as a specific kind of cultural antenna, tuned to frequencies that more cautious institutions were not receiving or were choosing not to transmit. The jokes that came true are not the most important thing about Family Guy. They are not what the show is primarily about, and they account for a small fraction of its total output across more than 2 decades. But they occupy a particular place in the show's reputation, a place that neither the writers nor the network fully sought, and that the audience has returned to repeatedly over the years, finding in each new example a confirmation of something they already half believed about the relationship between comedy and truth and the specific vision of the world that a room full of people with very open ears can occasionally produce. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The pattern of jokes that anticipated real events says something specific about how the show has always engaged with the world beyond Quahog. But the world beyond Quahog has also changed the show in ways that were not about comedy at all. Ways that forced the people behind it to reckon with questions about representation and voice and who has the right to speak for a character. That reckoning is coming up next. Section 9. The voices that changed and the characters they left behind. Casting decisions in animation are invisible in a way that casting decisions in live-action television are not. When a drama recast a lead role, the audience sees the new face immediately, and the change is impossible to miss. When an animated show recast a character, the change arrives through a speaker, filtered through a voice that the audience has come to associate not with a visible person, but with a drawing, a set of lines on a screen, a personality built over years of episodes. The attachment is to the voice itself, rather than to the body it comes from, which makes recasting an animation a strange and specific kind of disruption, one that some audiences barely notice and others find deeply unsettling. Family Guy has recast several of its characters across its long run, for reasons ranging from scheduling conflicts to personal decisions to the kind of industry-wide reckoning that arrived in 2020 and changed how animation studios thought about the relationship between the people doing the voicing and the characters being voiced. Each of those recasting stories has its own shape, its own set of circumstances, and its own aftermath. Taken together, they form a narrative about how a show changes across decades, how the values of the people making it evolve, and how the entertainment industry sometimes catches up to conversations it has been avoiding for a very long time. The earliest significant recasting in the show's
history was also its quietest. Lacey Chabert voiced Meg Griffin through the first season and into the early production of the second, before leaving the role due to her commitments to the drama series Party of Five and the demands of her schoolwork at the time. The departure was handled without public conflict. Mila Kunis came in, and the character continued more or less without interruption, at least from the audience's perspective. For viewers who had been watching from the beginning, the voice was noticeably different, but the change was absorbed relatively easily because Meg was still a relatively underdeveloped character at that point in the show's run, still being figured out by the writers, still finding the shape that would define her across the decades that followed. There was not yet enough of an established Meg for the recasting to feel like a significant loss. Chabert did return, in a manner, through archival recordings used in the 10th season episode Back to the Pilot. In that episode, Brian and Stewie travel back to the events of the first episode, and the Meg who exists in that past speaks in Chabert's original voice, preserved from recordings made more than a decade earlier. The contrast between the two voices, audible to anyone paying attention, was a quiet acknowledgement that the character had literally been two different people at different points in the show's life. A later episode went further, having Stewie explain in dialogue that time had reversed itself to such an extent that Meg's voice had reverted from one actress to the other, a self-aware joke that turned the production reality of recasting into an in-universe event. Connie D'Amico, the popular girl who served as Meg's primary tormentor at school, was recast early in the show's run without much public discussion. Fairuza Balk had voiced the character in 2 episodes during the first season, before the role was given to Lisa Wilhoit, who has played the character ever since. The reason for the change was never publicly explained in any detail, and the recasting happened early enough in the show's life that it left almost no mark on the audience's relationship with the character. The recastings that arrived in 2020 were of a different nature entirely. They did not come from scheduling conflicts or personal decisions or the ordinary mechanics of production. They came from a cultural moment, a period of sustained public reckoning with the question of who gets to speak for characters of color in animated entertainment, and what it means when the answer to that question has historically been that almost anyone can, regardless of their own background. The question had existed long before 2020. Animation has a history stretching back decades of white voice actors playing characters of races other than their own, a practice that had been accepted as standard without much examination for most of the medium's history. The argument for the practice was that voice acting was a purely technical skill, that the audience could not see the actor, and that therefore the actor's race was irrelevant to their ability to perform the role. The argument against it was that the characters existed in a cultural context, that they represented communities to audiences from those communities, and that having a white actor speak for a black character was a form of appropriation that denied employment and representation to actors who could have brought their own experience to the role. In the summer of 2020, following the killing of George Floyd and the global wave of attention that followed, animation studios faced this question with a new urgency. Several white voice actors who had been playing characters of color announced that they would be stepping down from those roles. The announcements came within days of each other across multiple shows, and Family Guy was among the programs affected. Mike Henry had voiced Cleveland Brown since the show's first episode in 1999. Cleveland was one of the show's most beloved supporting characters, the soft-spoken and endlessly patient neighbor who lived on Spooner Street with Peter Griffin, and who had developed across years of episodes into a figure of genuine warmth and moral consistency. Henry had voiced Cleveland for more than 20 years, had developed the character's distinctive vocal inflection, drawing on accents he had observed in Virginia and Maryland, and had extended the character into a spin-off series that ran for 4 seasons on Fox. He had, by any reasonable measure, defined the character as much as any single person could define an animated creation. Henry announced his decision on social media in June of 2020 with a statement that was direct and without self-justification. He said it had been an honor to play Cleveland for 20 years and that he loved the character, but that persons of color should play characters of color, and that he would therefore be stepping down from the role. He did not frame the statement as a sacrifice or as a moral triumph. He framed it as a correction, the acknowledgement of something that should have been done differently from the beginning, and that could at least be done differently from this point forward. He added that he would remain a series regular on Family Guy, continuing to voice a range of other characters, including Bruce, the performance artist, Herbert, the elderly neighbor whose obsessive interest in Chris Griffin has always occupied one of the show's darkest comedic corners, and various additional recurring roles. The departure from Cleveland was specifically about Cleveland, not about his relationship with the show more broadly. The search for a replacement centered on finding someone who could maintain the vocal qualities that audiences associated with Cleveland while bringing an authentic connection
connection to the character's identity. The person Fox and the production settled on was Arif Zahir, a comedian and content creator who had built a substantial following on YouTube through impression videos, several of which featured his own performances of Cleveland Brown's voice. Zahir's Cleveland impressions had accumulated millions of views before he was ever considered for the actual role, which meant that Fox was not taking a chance on an unknown quantity. They were hiring someone who had already demonstrated, publicly and repeatedly, that he could inhabit the character's voice in a way that felt genuine to the people who watched him do it. Zahir's statement on receiving the role was generous toward Henry and toward the responsibility he was taking on. He described Cleveland as his favorite cartoon character of all time, and said he had been shocked when Henry stepped down, assuming it meant the character would never be heard from again. The gratitude in the statement was specific rather than performative. The gratitude of someone who had spent years doing impressions of a character for free on the internet and was now being paid to do what he had already been doing out of genuine love for the material. Henry's own statement welcoming Zahir was equally warm. He said Zahir's vocal talent was obvious, and that his understanding of Cleveland and his respect for the character gave him confidence that the role was in good hands. The exchange between the departing actor and his replacement was handled with more care than these transitions often are, which made it easier for the audience to follow the show into its new relationship with one of its most familiar voices. Zahir began voicing Cleveland in season 19, which entered production in 2020. The episodes of season 18 that had already been completed, or were in advanced stages of animation when Henry made his announcement, continued to feature Henry's voice, meaning there was a brief overlap period during which the same character was voiced by two different people in episodes that aired in the same season. Most viewers who were paying attention noticed. Most viewers who were not paying attention did not. The Cleveland recasting was the most significant voice change of the 2020 period for Family Guy specifically, but it existed alongside similar changes at other animated shows that were navigating the same question simultaneously. The Simpsons made comparable announcements. Central Park, a newer animated series, saw a white actress step down from a mixed-race character. The moment was industry-wide rather than isolated, a collective acknowledgement arriving at roughly the same time across multiple productions that have been operating under the same assumptions for decades. The death of Adam West in June of 2017 produced a different kind of voice change, one that had nothing to do with cultural recasting and everything to do with simple, irreplaceable loss. West had voiced a fictionalized version of himself as the mayor of Quahog since the show's earliest seasons, a role that drew directly on his persona as the actor who had played Batman on television in the 1960s, and who had spent the decades since developing a specific kind of self-aware relationship with that legacy. The character of Adam West on Family Guy was not a parody of Adam West. It was a collaboration with him, a version of himself that he performed knowingly, understanding exactly what the joke was and participating in it with a commitment that made the character genuinely funny rather than merely referential. West appeared in more than 100 episodes across the show's run before his death at 88 from leukemia. His absence left a specific gap that the production had to decide how to fill, and the decision they made was instructive. Rather than simply recasting the role with another actor playing Mayor Adam West, the show retired the character and introduced a new mayor of Quahog, voiced by Sam Elliott. Elliott declined to play himself, an instinct that the production found creatively useful rather than limiting. Executive producer Richard Appel said publicly that Elliott's reluctance to play himself had prompted them to think more carefully about what the mayor role actually required, and that the answer they arrived at was that it required someone doing what Adam West had done, which was playing a heightened and self-aware version of a familiar persona, rather than a straightforward character. Elliott brought his own considerable persona to a new character, and the show moved forward without pretending it could replace what West had given it. The show has also navigated the loss of other recurring voices across its long run. Carrie Fisher, who had voiced the character of Peter's boss Angela, died in December of 2016. The character was retired rather than recast, with the production making a deliberate choice not to have another actor step into a role that Fisher had made specifically her own. The finale of Angela's storyline, when it eventually came, handled her departure from the show with a degree of care that reflected the real loss behind the creative decision. What the accumulated history of these voice changes reveals about Family Guy is something that the show's critics might find surprising, and its defenders might find confirming. A show that has spent decades being accused of insensitivity, of treating real people and real communities as material to be processed without care, has navigated the recasting of its characters with a degree of thoughtfulness that is not always visible in the finished product, but that is clearly present in the decisions made behind it. The Cleveland recasting was handled
handled with transparency and respect. The Adam West transition was handled with honesty about what could not be replaced.
The Carrie Fisher situation was handled with the simplest and most direct form of acknowledgement, which was the acknowledgement that some absences cannot be filled. The voices that have changed over Family Guy's run are a record of time passing, of the industry changing, of people being lost and new people arriving, of a show that is old enough to have outlasted some of the people who built it and to have had to reckon, in real time, with questions about representation that did not exist in their current form when the show began. None of those changes have been simple, and none of them have resolved every question they raised, but they have each been navigated with more care than the show's general reputation for recklessness might suggest, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about any institution that has existed long enough to be forced by time and circumstance to become something other than what it was. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The voices have changed, the characters have evolved, and the world around the show has shifted in ways nobody anticipated when a 24-year-old with a $50,000 budget recorded voices in his kitchen in 1998. What remains is the question of what all of it amounts to, what Family Guy has meant across more than a quarter century on the air, and where it sits now in the long story of American television. That is where this ends. Section 10. 25 years in Quahog. Quarter centuries are rare in television. The medium moves quickly, tastes shift, the audiences that made a show necessary in one decade drift toward different things in the next, and the shows that seemed permanent turn out to have been products of a specific moment that passed without anyone fully noticing it was passing. The Simpsons is the obvious exception, the anchor against which every other long-running animated show measures itself, the standard that seemed unreachable until it became simply the standard. Family Guy is the other exception, the show that was canceled twice and came back both times, and kept going, season after season, well past the point where most observers predicted it would run out of reasons to continue. The distance between those two cancellations and where the show sits now is one of the stranger journeys in the history of American entertainment, and it deserves to be looked at slowly and with some care, because the easy version of the story misses most of what makes it worth telling. As of 2026, Family Guy has aired more than 460 episodes across 24 seasons. Disney, which acquired the show as part of its purchase of 21st Century Fox in 2019, announced in April of 2025 a renewal that will carry the series through at least 4 additional seasons, taking it to the 2028 to 2029 television season, which will coincide with the 30th anniversary of the Super Bowl night in January 1999, when 22 million people watched The Griffin Family for the first time. The show that was almost canceled before it finished its second season, the show whose creator overslept on the morning of September 11th and missed a flight that killed everyone aboard, the show that was brought back from death by the people who refused to stop buying its DVDs, is now contracted to run until its 4th decade. That sentence would have been incomprehensible to anyone sitting in a Fox executive's office in May of 2002, watching the cancellation announcement go out. The numbers that surround the show in its later years tell a story that its early ratings history could not have predicted. In a single week, in August of 2024, Family Guy generated more than 834 million minutes of viewership across streaming platforms, ranking it among the 10 most streamed television programs in the country. The following week, it crossed 1 billion minutes, placing it 3rd overall. By the end of 2025, Disney reported that Family Guy was among the small number of television series to surpass 1 billion hours streamed on Disney Plus across the full year. These are not the numbers of a show coasting on legacy, or being watched out of habit by people who remember it fondly from their teenage years. They are the numbers of a show that has found genuinely new audiences in the streaming era while retaining the older ones, a generational handoff that most programs of its age never manage, and that speaks to something durable in the material itself, something that survives translation across decades and formats, and the entirely different experience of watching on a phone at midnight versus watching on a television on a Sunday night in 1999. Peter Griffin entered Fortnite in December of 2023. The character appeared as a playable skin in the Battle Royale game that has become one of the primary cultural spaces where younger audiences exist, and McFarlane's public comment about the collaboration was characteristically honest. He said he had to have somebody explain to him what Fortnite was before he agreed to it, and that once it was explained, he thought it sounded cool and said yes. The Peter Griffin skin became one of the more widely discussed additions to the game in that period, and Ernie the Giant Chicken was added a month later, and Cleveland Brown followed in 2025, alongside characters from other animated series. A cartoon family from
a fictional town in Rhode Island that first appeared on American television more than 25 years ago, is now playable in a video game with hundreds of millions of active users. The cultural distance between those two facts is genuinely strange to sit with, and the fact that it does not feel stranger than it does is itself a measure of how thoroughly Family Guy has embedded itself in the fabric of the culture it has spent 25 years satirizing. The show's place in the history of American television is now settled enough that it does not require argument. Family Guy was the first canceled program ever revived based on DVD sales, a fact that changed how networks thought about canceled shows and created a template that subsequent revivals have followed in the years since. It was nominated in 2009 for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series, the first animated series to receive that nomination since The Flintstones in 1961, a gap of nearly 5 decades that the nomination collapsed in a single announcement. It spawned 2 spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, which ran for 4 seasons before Cleveland returned to Quahog, and American Dad, which began as a companion piece and has itself become one of the longer-running animated comedies in television history.
The franchise that grew from a student thesis film made almost entirely by one person in a dormitory now encompasses hundreds of episodes across multiple series, video games, pinball machines, mobile applications, merchandise that fills entire sections of convention floors, and a streaming presence that keeps expanding as the years accumulate. Seth MacFarlane's own relationship with the show he created has evolved in ways that mirror the show's evolution. He stopped writing for it around 2010, stepping back from the writer's room to focus on producing, voice acting, and the other creative projects that Family Guy had made possible for him, including the TED films, The Orville, and a music career that has seen him record several albums of classic American standards. He was briefly absent from the show during the 2023 Writers Guild of America strike, when showrunners left their productions in solidarity with the striking writers. The show has continued under the stewardship of executive producers who have been with it long enough to understand what it is and what it should remain. The MacFarlane who records Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire in a professional studio with full technical support is a different figure from the one who sat in his kitchen recording voices alone on a budget of $50,000. But the voices themselves have not changed in any way that the audience can detect, and that continuity is its own kind of achievement across a span of more than 25 years. What has changed, and what the later seasons reflect more honestly than the earlier ones did, is the world the show exists inside. The comedy that felt transgressive and genuinely dangerous in 1999 exists in a different context in 2026, surrounded by a culture that has processed and in many cases exhausted many of the provocations the show once deployed with the confidence of someone doing something genuinely new. The cutaway gag has been imitated so widely across 25 years of television and internet video that it has become a structural convention of comedy rather than a stylistic innovation specific to this show. The willingness to make jokes about real events and real people, which once distinguished Family Guy from almost everything else on network television, is now a standard feature of comedy across multiple platforms and formats. The show did not cause all of these changes, but it contributed to them substantially. And watching the early episodes now is partly an experience of watching a show that has become so influential that its influence has wrapped all the way back around to make the original seem almost ordinary, which is perhaps the highest compliment that can be paid to something that once felt genuinely unlike anything else. The question of whether the show declined in quality is one that critics, long-term viewers, and the people who make it have all engaged with at different points and with different conclusions. The consensus position, shared by a significant portion of the audience that has followed the show across its full run, is that the first 7 seasons represent the show at its most consistent, and that the quality has varied considerably since the revival of 2005. MacFarlane himself indicated in an interview that the show had run longer than he had originally envisioned, a statement that carries within it an honest acknowledgement that sustaining creative momentum across hundreds of episodes over more than 2 decades is a fundamentally different challenge from the one he was solving when he spent 6 months drawing in his kitchen in 1998. The show has produced remarkable episodes in its later seasons, episodes that hold up against anything in the earlier run, and it has produced episodes that barely resemble what made it remarkable in the first place. The ratio between those two kinds of episodes has shifted over time in ways that the audience has noticed and discussed, with a candor that the internet makes impossible to avoid. And the show has absorbed that candor and continued producing episodes anyway, which is either a sign of creative resilience or institutional stubbornness, depending on where one stands. The characters themselves have changed across those decades in ways that become visible when the early episodes and the recent ones are
watched in close proximity.
Peter Griffin has become crueler and less sympathetic in the later seasons than he was at the beginning, a shift that some viewers find consistent with the internal logic of his character, and others find a departure from the version of the show they originally cared about. Brian has cycled through several distinct personalities across the run, moving from the grounded and slightly melancholy writer of the early seasons through a prolonged period of self-righteousness and back towards something more recognizable as the character he began as, a journey that has not always been graceful, but that has produced some genuinely interesting television at its best moments. Stewie has softened from the world domination-obsessed infant of the first season into something closer to an eccentric and emotionally complex child, a change the writers made deliberately and that most observers consider one of the more successful long-term character evolutions the show has attempted. The relationship between Stewie and Brian, which developed across the middle seasons into the emotional center of the show's finest work, has produced some of the most genuinely affecting television that Family Guy has ever made. The Road 2 episodes standing as a body of work that the show can be defended on the strength of alone. What the show built, across all of it, across the cancellations and the lawsuits and the banned episodes and the dog that died and came back and the man who overslept and lived and kept making television for another 25 years, is something that resists the kind of clean summary that criticism usually reaches for. Family Guy is not a show about anything in the way that dramas are about things. Its subject, insofar as it has a subject, is the texture of American life at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, filtered through the specific comedic vision of a man from Connecticut who went to art school in Rhode Island and spent 6 months drawing in his kitchen and ended up making something that more than 1 billion hours of human attention have been spent watching. The cutaway gags that critics found lazy and fans found endlessly rewatchable are themselves a kind of argument about how memory and culture actually function, the way a conversation leaps from one reference to another and back without losing its essential thread, the way a mind stocked with decades of popular culture cannot help but think in associations rather than straight lines. Stewie Griffin, the infant villain who became something more complicated and more beloved than any villain, remains the character that most clearly carries what the show has always been at its best. The voice that Seth MacFarlane developed from a Rex Harrison impression done in college to entertain people at parties has become one of the most recognized voices in American entertainment. A voice that has appeared in commercials and award ceremonies and crossovers with other shows, and a cameo in a primetime drama about FBI agents. A voice that has won Emmy Awards and Annie Awards, and that IGN named the best character the show has ever produced. The football-shaped head, and the red overalls, and the teddy bear named Rupert, and the elaborate schemes against a mother who has spent 25 years remaining almost entirely unaware of them, are as fixed in the cultural imagination as anything a cartoon has produced in the last 3 decades. MacFarlane said once that Stewie was an evil Rex Harrison, a description that remains the most efficient summary of the character anyone has managed. Brian Griffin drinks his martini. Peter hurts himself on the stairs in a sequence that became a piece of internet shorthand before the language for describing such things had fully developed. Meg absorbs what the family gives her and keeps coming back season after season with a patience that the show eventually acknowledged was its own kind of strength. Quagmire says his word. Cleveland falls out of his bathtub in a running joke that survived his departure for a spin-off and his return and the recasting of his voice and every other disruption the show has thrown at it. Joe Swanson sits in his wheelchair at the end of the bar at the Drunken Clam and remains, against all narrative probability, a man who believes things will work out. The town of Quahog stands where it has always stood, somewhere in Rhode Island that is not quite on any map, built from the details of a place MacFarlane knew and the logic of a show that needed somewhere specific to happen. 30 years is a very long time for anything to last. A show that was canceled twice, that nearly lost its creator on a September morning, that was kept alive by an audience buying discs of something a network had thrown away, that had its dog killed and brought back and its cast rebuilt and its boundaries tested in courtrooms and congressional offices and the living rooms of people who complained to the FCC should not still be here. Most things with that history are not. Family Guy is. And the simplest explanation is also the truest one. The people who found it never fully let it go, and the people who made it never stopped showing up to make it. And somewhere in that mutual stubbornness, a cartoon about a dysfunctional family in a fictional Rhode Island town became one of the longest-running pieces of American television ever produced. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.